All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be the last section of Chapter 4 that we're going to go ahead and look at. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at how some different cycles of matter and nutrients move throughout our ecosystem or our biosphere. So first off, when we look at the cycles of matter, there's some really essential elements that every single living thing needs, and those are oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And we're going to look at how and why we need some of those things, and we're going to look at why that's crucial to all living organisms. Now, when we talked about energy in the last section, we talked about how energy moves in one direction. When we look at these different nutrients that we're going to look at in this section, we're actually going to look at the fact that they recycle. Okay, they go through cycles, which is why they are named cycles of matter. Okay, and when we recycle something, it means that it gets used somewhere, and then it goes ahead and is able to come back all the way around the process again. So we recycle all of these nutrients. So we might use up some water, but it's going to go ahead and get put back into the atmosphere and eventually make its way back around. So it's really important that this stuff that we're going to talk about here, our matter, our elements, those things are going to be recycled, unlike energy that only goes kind of in one direction and does not get recycled. Now, when we look at what a biogeochemical cycle is, it's how the elements that we just talked about here, okay, or compounds like water, and how matter, just everything that everything is made up of, how that passes from the biosphere to our different organisms and then back into the biosphere. So kind of how things recycle and move throughout the biosphere that we know. Now, when we look at our cycles of matter, the first one we're going to go ahead and look at is what's called the water cycle. This is the one that you guys are probably most familiar with, okay? And what we look at is the fact that every single living thing needs water. Okay? In order to live, we have to have water. Water makes up about 75% of our body, as well as any other living organism. So it's very crucial that we're able to get water in. Now, some of the different parts of the water cycle, okay, first thing is we have evaporation. Evaporation is when water is going to, from heat, turn into a gas and evaporate into the atmosphere. Okay? Condensation is when water turns from a gas into a liquid water droplet. Okay, so condensation is actually when it cools down in the atmosphere and forms clouds. Then we have precipitation. Precipitation is how the water is going to fall back from the atmosphere in the clouds back to the ground itself. So whether it comes in the form of rain, snow, sleet, whatever it may be, precipitation is how it comes up from the atmosphere, from those clouds, back down to the ground. Okay, then we can have what's called runoff. Runoff is simply looking at how water is going to flow over the land itself. Okay, so when that rain comes down and hits the mountains and things, how it kind of rolls down the mountains, and then it eventually ends up usually into some type of body of water. Then groundwater, okay, think about when it rains here, we know that our lawns absorb that water. So groundwater is just the water being absorbed through the soil, through the ground itself, and it goes ahead and goes deeper and deeper into the ground, and eventually it can sometimes lead into a body of water as well. Okay, the next thing is what's called transpiration. Transpiration deals with plants. So transpiration is when our plants evaporate water out of their leaves and out of other parts of their the plant itself. So transpiration is really just how the water gets released from a surface of a plant. And then respiration comes and deals with how organisms, including ourselves, how we exhale water vapor. Every time we exhale, we have some water vapor coming out. So those are kind of the different ways we can see the water move throughout the actual environment. So if we look at a bigger version of that water cycle, okay, realistically, we're going to have water either in a lake, an ocean, a river, okay, somewhere we see that water being held. And what happens is with heat, okay, that water is going to turn into a gas and it's going to evaporate up into the atmosphere. Then, because it's colder up there, that water is going to condensate and it's going to become then actual liquid form again. It's going to be stored in clouds, and eventually they go ahead and release that in the form of precipitation. That then comes back down as snow or rain or sleet. Okay, once that water comes back down, it's going to go ahead and land onto the various surfaces, and we're going to see runoff where it's going to go ahead and roll over those surfaces, might roll back into a lake, a river, an ocean, or it might run over to a surface and it might get absorbed into the ground as groundwater. Okay, then we also might see some plants releasing water back into the atmosphere to then go ahead and again condensate into our clouds. We ourselves are releasing some water when we breathe out. That goes into the atmosphere and also goes into the clouds. But either way, it all comes back down in that precipitation and then goes ahead and either goes into the ground or some other form where water is being held. Okay, and that's just really kind of how it moves from the land, from a water source up into the atmosphere, and then how it comes back down. Now, the next things we're going to look at are what we call nutrient cycles. Nutrients are things that are absolutely required to sustain life. So it helps build muscles, helps build tissues, helps us carry out everything that we need to do in order to live. So we're going to look at 3 different nutrient cycles here. And the first one we're going to go ahead and look at is the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle, when we look at carbon itself, why we need it. Okay, we need carbon in order to go ahead and produce carbohydrates, which help give us energy. We need it to go ahead and produce fats, which also give us energy. We need proteins that help build muscle. And we need it also to go ahead and make DNA, which we know is our genetic material. So carbon cycle is very, very important to all living things. Now, there's some major parts of the carbon cycle, okay, where we're able to get carbon from. So photosynthesis is one of them, because if we look at photosynthesis, and we look at the chemical equation, we have CO2 plus H2O, and that's going to make glucose, which is C6H12O6 plus O2. So when we look at where carbon may be coming from or going to in photosynthesis, we have the carbon dioxide right here that has carbon in it, and then it's producing glucose, which also has carbon in it. Now, when we look at respiration, what we go through to go ahead and make some energy, that is C6H12O6, okay, some more carbon, plus some oxygen, and that's going to give us carbon dioxide and water. So again, when we look at these 2 major biological processes, we can see where that carbon is coming from. In the next few chapters, we're going to talk about those 2 processes as well. Okay, now decomposition, like our decomposers, that's the breakdown of any dead material. So whenever something dies and those decomposers come in, they're going to break down that dead material, and that's going to allow for remaining carbon to get put back into the atmosphere as well. Another way that we see carbon added, sometimes not so good, is burning of forests and also burning of fossil fuels. So when we burn fossil fuels in factories and things, our cars, all the emissions that are let out, that is also adding additional carbon dioxide to our environment. And again, that carbon then is going to go ahead and be used and be brought back into the environment. But a lot of times also that creates problems like global warming and things. So burning of fossil fuels in forests, not always the most positive way to have carbon recycled. So when we look here at a visual of the carbon cycle, a couple things we can look at. We've got our photosynthesis, okay, we've got our respiration, those things we just talked about, and how we can go ahead and add carbon in or bring carbon into the atmosphere or bring it back into an organism. Okay, when anytime an organism dies, whether it be plant or animal, that's going to go through decomposition and be brought back into the soil to go ahead and move throughout the cycles again. Okay, factory emissions, any type of burning of our forests, that also adds to it. Okay, so again, we just kind of see where that carbon is being added, and then it goes as carbon dioxide when we breathe it out through respiration and things. It goes into the then atmosphere, but then it can be taken back in by our plants through photosynthesis, etc. So that carbon's constantly moving through its cycle. Okay, now the next one we're going to look at is what's called the nitrogen cycle. Why we need nitrogen is so that we can make proteins. Proteins are super, super important for muscle building. Okay, we need proteins to keep us alive, to keep us healthy, and to provide us with muscle. Okay, there's a couple major parts of the nitrogen cycle. The biggest one is what's called nitrogen fixation. So the majority of our nitrogen is in the gas form in our atmosphere. And the problem is that plants cannot use that type of nitrogen. So instead, what happens is we have these bacteria, super, super crucial. These bacteria, what they do is they fix the nitrogen. So by fixing it or changing that nitrogen, they change it from this gas form in the atmosphere into a usable form that our plants can take in. Okay, and then that way our plants can uptake that nitrogen. Animals eat the plants to get their nitrogen. And again, as always, whenever any animal or plant dies, it decomposes, and that nitrogen can also be put back into the soil to be used. Okay, but a big, big point is that nitrogen fixation. These bacteria that take the nitrogen from the atmosphere fix it or change it so that our plants can go ahead and take it up and actually use it. So if we look at the nitrogen cycle itself, okay, again, like I said, most of the nitrogen cycle, okay, is in this form here. Okay, nitrogen as a gas in the atmosphere. And the problem is that plants, they cannot take it in that way. So what we have is that nitrogen fixation occurring where this bacteria is actually going to fix or change this nitrogen in the atmosphere so that plants can take it up. Okay, and then again, once plants take it up, the plants have the nitrogen in them. Organisms are going to eat those plants that then get the nitrogen in their muscles and their tissue. Then we as top consumers will eat those animals or we'll eat the plants themselves to get our nitrogen. But either way, then that nitrogen is going to move through the food chain itself. Okay, and lastly, as always, when anything dies, it's going to decompose, and that's going to allow the nitrogen that is in those animals and those plants to decompose and break back down into the soil to be taken up by the plants again. Okay, the last cycle we're going to look at is the phosphorus cycle. The major reason we need phosphorus in our lives is for DNA. Okay, phosphorus is needed to make DNA, very, very important. Okay, but the problem is with the phosphorus cycle is it must be actually released from rocks. So it's a little bit longer process, takes a little bit more time, and doesn't move through the biosphere as quickly as some of the other cycles. Okay, some of the parts of the phosphorus cycle is weathering. Weathering is how phosphorus is released from the rocks by rain or by weather that goes ahead and kind of breaks down those rocks themselves to go ahead and actually release the phosphorus that is held in those rocks. So weathering is very important. Seepage is how then the phosphorus, once it's released from the rocks, how it gets into then the ground through the water, kind of pulling it down into the water system and through the soil. So the water kind of rolls over those rocks. The rocks release some phosphorus. The water gets absorbed through seepage into the ground, and that brings that phosphorus in. Once it's into the ground and into the soil, again, our roots are able to take it up from our plants. And again, similar to the nitrogen cycle, we have animals that are going to eat those plants, or we have animals that are going to eat animals that ate those plants, and they're able to get their phosphorus through that process. So we eat animals or plants that have already gotten the phosphorus, so then we can get our phosphorus that we need. And lastly, as always, anytime anything dies, we have that decomposition process. So anytime any organism dies, it's going to decompose. Any phosphorus remaining within that organism can go ahead and be put back into the soil and into the ground to go ahead and keep that phosphorus moving throughout. When we look at a phosphorus cycle here, again, we have that weathering of rocks where those rocks are going to get broken down and actually release that phosphorus that then is going to be brought into the soil through water. and then it can be picked up by our plants, which then our animals can eat those plants, or animals can eat animals that ate plants and go ahead and start moving it through the food chain. Okay, and then again, when any of those things die, we're going to have that decomposition that's going to put that remaining phosphorus back into the soil. Now, the last part we're going to talk about is when some of these nutrients are limited. So we can have what's called a limiting nutrient, and that's a nutrient that limits how productive the ecosystem can be. So how well the ecosystem runs is completely dependent on the availability of things like phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon. So if we're having a limiting amount of something, our ecosystem might not be able to run as productive as it wants to. So something very common that farmers do, okay, and we ourselves even do, is we actually add fertilizer to our fields or to our lawns, and that helps increase the amount of nutrients that we have, like nitrogen and phosphorus. So we get better yield. So we get more crops, we get more green, nice, full grass in our lawns. So that's something that we can add. So we know that our soil is limited on the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus we have. So that's a limiting nutrient. And instead, we can go ahead and sometimes add things to it that go ahead and help that. Now, the problem is whenever something is considered a limiting nutrient, okay, there can be some negative effects. So whenever something is a limiting nutrient, okay, we can have a negative effect to it. We're going to look at that on the next slide. So if something is a limiting nutrient and all of a sudden it changes from being limited to super, super abundant, having a whole lot of it, we can have a huge growth of algae. So something very common that you might see is in ponds or lakes, you might see kind of this green algae floating around all the time. And that's because what happened is a lot of times phosphorus or nitrogen is a limited nutrient, and it somehow becomes very abundant all at once, and it causes the algae to grow super, super fast. It kind of takes over that pond, and it's adverse or negative because a lot of times it takes out the oxygen that the fish and others that are using that water need. So then it can go ahead and start killing the fish that are living in that water. So algae blooms are kind of caused by where you have a limiting nutrient and all of a sudden it becomes very abundant, like phosphorus or nitrogen from fertilizer, and can it cause that algae to take over that pond or that lake, and then it can start killing the organisms that live in that pond or lake. So limiting nutrients are there for a reason, and we always don't want to add too much to that to go ahead and possibly cause some adverse or negative effects. Okay. Otherwise, that's about it for this section. Okay, make sure you ask questions if you have them, and then we should be good for the chapter.